Welcome back, Professor Shire. You spoke to us a day before the Zimbabwe elections where you successfully predicted that ZANU-PF would win the elections. The elections have come and gone, and now there's a lot of talk that the elections were rigged. From your own opinion, do you think there was any rigging in these elections?
Absolutely not. You would have to really give the evidence to show why. Well, first of all, we have to describe what we mean by rigging, and the second, we have to show the evidence to support that claim. The first thing to say is that a lot of people, those people who were wanting to, the campaign to discredit these elections began a long time ago, and it's the same people who started on the campaign by wanting to discredit before it began, who are also now claiming that the election was rigged. That's one thing. And no one ever seems to actually ask the question, what do they mean by rigging? Do they mean that the votes that were cast were then altered? Do they mean that the people, that there is evidence to show that the votes that were cast are not necessarily cast by the people who are supposed to on the register and so on? Nobody actually knows what these people mean by the election. There is no evidence to back up these claims. And that's what I would say.
Okay, there are also some media reports that claim that 15 and 16-year-old people were voting as 50 and 70-year-olds. So now the question is, how come during the voting process they were not able to identify that 15-year-olds were voting as 80-year-old people? Do you actually have an idea of the voting process in Zimbabwe and who actually checks the IDs? Because as far as I'm concerned, they have all the representatives from the political parties at the polling stations.
But let's start with the French. The process is like this. First of all, people would have to be on the electoral roll. They can only be on the electoral roll if you yourself individually registered to vote. That's the first thing. The second thing is people would then identify themselves either by producing an identity card or some other identification that made deemed acceptable to Zimbabwean authorities. And the third, they would have to turn up in person and establish their fingerprint on the electoral staff for those people. And that would be double checked not just by the officers administering the election, but observed both by electoral agents and the observers themselves. Now, all those things put together would mean that it is impossible for somebody who is not there to have voted. Even if from the outset, even if someone who's 16 who voted, who committed themselves fraud, does not mean, therefore, the vote was rigged. It means somebody committed fraud. You would have to prove that was the case. One would have to prove, for example, if there was a George Shire registered on the electoral voters roll in machine, let's say, and someone else turned up claiming to themselves, produce some identification cards, unless they get two people with the same name, they would have to produce identification cards that show that who they are. So the claims are invalid in as much as they don't, one would have to demonstrate when the fraud took place. These are just claims and allegations which are being made simply to discredit the poll, and they do not add up. There is no evidence so far to back this claim up.
Okay, there have been some pictures of IDs that have been published in various press that actually show dead people whose IDs were found near the polling stations, and the allegations are that the ZANU-PF people actually dumped these IDs after voting close to the polling stations. Do you think ZANU-PF would do such a thing to use IDs of dead people and then throw them close to the polling stations, or do you think it is the work of another party trying to discredit ZANU-PF?
Don't put anything right. The level of the kind of allegation, some people have to be so sophisticated, super sophisticated, in the first instance to identify who else on the electoral register who is dead. The amount of money, and let's put it this way, if I have my birth certificate now, or my passport now, it takes forever before I can get a replacement. administratively, not because you don't want to give it me, because administratively costs the amount of money it will cost to do it on a switch, even when they have it, is huge. Now, that technique on top of being given. If someone is dead, and you need to know someone actually is dead, you need to be able to collect their identity card too, and you have to allocate that particular person to someone else. The amount of administrative process that you need to do is humongous, and to be able then to cast it around to effect this kind of is impossible. This is a fantasy. Each claim on the face of it is contradictory on itself without even producing a counter evidence to the contrary. It's undoable. Simple and straightforward as that. The second argument is if I'm only wanting to or anybody else who is trying to kind of like cheat in the way in which it's being described, it would be stupid for them to leave the evidence lying around in the way in which it's been claimed as being. If you can't say on one hand, Zimbabwe is so sophisticated to have been able to do X, Y, Z. But the more crucial point is this. All these processes, the electoral process, ZEC, all were acting on behalf of the coalition government. They were not acting on behalf of ZANU. You know, ZEC is made out of commissioners nominated by all the political parties that participate. It is very principles to the political parties. The institutions in Zimbabwe are owned by the government, not by ZANU-PF. So this was not a political process organized by ZANU-PF. This was a process organized by the government. Now, the reason I'm making that claim is this. All the irregularities or the shortcomings, call it what you may, about the process from A to Z, could have been challenged by anyone before the election. So, you know, a month before this election, the same electoral roll was available to anyone for the purposes of the referendum. The MDC did not raise an objection to that. Right after the election day itself, anyone could check if their name was on the electoral roll. MDC did not raise an objection to that. Because someone is on the electoral roll, the electoral rolls do not vote. People vote. People who are on the electoral roll vote. People who were turned out away from voting either did not have an identification to prove who they were, or they were not on the electoral vote. So even if you allow for all the people who will turn around and pile them up to the MDC, it still does not produce a majority popular vote for them. So there is no evidence, absolutely, on one end that shows that this process has been manipulated one way or the other. There is also no evidence that shows that the popular vote would have ended up in any other way other than a ZANU-PF Robert Mugabe victory.
Okay, another allegation is that Niku rigged the elections, and after rigging the elections, they went to South Africa where they provided the evidence that they used to help ZANU-PF to rig the elections. I'm sure you've heard this one, that they used ballot papers they used had a watermark, so if anyone voted for Morgan Tsvangirai, within 4 hours it would move and go on to Mugabe's space, and technically that person would have voted for Mugabe. Is that possible at all?
You know, I mean, unless you believe in guns, and I don't, you know, unless people believe that Mother Teresa was seen on in my place yesterday, and I don't. I mean, this is just, the fiction gets wilder and wilder each day. It's just dumping. It is not credible. It doesn't pass water. It's ludicrous, to say the least. The idea that somehow you can find some technology of an ink that can transfer an X into another box without any within a period of time is ridiculous. It's bullshit. I mean, I'm sorry to use that word. I think people should come get their senses properly. It is not the case. If ZANU was wanted to manipulate the vote the route, why didn't they manipulate Chocho? You know, I mean, it's ridiculous. ZANU really rigged the vote so that Contact would lose and the NBCT would win. These allegations are way out of the mark. We really need to get back to reality as it exists, not some fanciful arguments which are just everywhere.
Okay, three great powers, Australia, Britain, and the United States of America, have said that the elections were not free and fair, and they've actually demanded that there should be a rerun of the elections. Do they have authority to call for rerun of the elections? Who has the power to call for rerun of the elections?
You know, first of all, no one is over Supreme Court, over Zimbabwe Supreme Court. The only people who can make that decision is the Zimbabwean Supreme Court following a challenge. And that's why the timeline of the Constitution makes it clear as soon as that claim is made, the thing goes through the court, and the court will make a decision. Okay? That's one. The second thing, Australia, Britain, and the United States began questioning the credibility of these elections before they even began. Okay? And what's interesting is the one observer group which they supported, i.e. ZNC, which they paid for, okay, are the ones who raised the objections to it. Nobody else is. So it doesn't surprise me that the United States, Australia, and Britain would say the components that they mark. But what they say is irrelevant. Irrelevant in the sense that they were not there. Irrelevant in the sense that they will have to tell us in what way they say those elections were not credible. Because you can say they were credible until cows come home. But unless you tell us exactly what is meant by that, they really are whistling in the wind. It's also disingenuous in the United States and Britain and Australia, because what they really are saying is that they will only accept the result that produces their preferred candidate. Now, if it does, and that really undermines the very spirit of democracy itself. It very undermines the legitimacy of anyone. What the majority will say, we will only accept leadership in Zimbabwe that they imposed. It is, to be honest, instead of trying to hide behind a myth that they cannot provide evidence for.
Okay, despite that, Morgan Tsvangirai has not yet produced the evidence showing that the elections were rigged. They have actually said the elections were not free and fair. And they've also said that besides the fact that SADC and AU observers have determined that the elections were free and fair, they are saying they are not fair. Does this mean that they are undermining SADC and the AU?
Well, they're not undermining themselves, they're undermining themselves. I think what happens is that, you see, I've always said over the years, the minute in the African continent, the minute a politician is seen to be aligned to the West, it's their albatross. The mood of the continent has been shifting gradually away from being seen to be influenced by the West in unprecedented terms. In fact, what then happens is that the longer the MDC on one hand does not accept the defeat, and the more the West speaks on his behalf in that way, the more it will create the conditions with the opposition itself internally loses credibility. The people who matter are Zimbabwean people first, its neighbors second, Africa third, the global south fourth, and the rest of the world last. And Morgan Tsvangirai continues to miss that ingredient as significant. And so, whichever is the West would be helpful in the MDC, literally, if they simply let Zimbabweans sort out their own situation. That's the key.
Okay, do you think that because Morgan has just lost the just ended elections, this now means the end of Morgan Tsvangirai himself and the NDC?
Well, the NDC is a big mountain to climb. The challenge for them is a number of ways. First of all, the parliamentary group, I think about 40 or 45 or thereabouts, would need to regroup. Okay? By regrouping, I mean they will have to reconcile their many differences. They've been operating under many surnames, MDC Gambara, MDC Mule, MDC God knows what. They really need to regroup into being one party. Okay? They're going to have to take my advice for it, but I think that's what they have to do. They secondly have to choose a new leader from within the parliamentary group. They need to choose, and that one person they choose is someone who has to have the support of the parliamentary group and able to appeal to the membership of the MDC generally. The third thing that the MDC has to do is to have a national appeal, a national story that is homegrown, that addresses Zimbabwe as it is now, in the light of the political map which has changed almost 100%, near to what it was 1980, dominated by some players. They can't continue to go on about Mugabe's 89 or Mugabe's devil. That doesn't satisfy anybody at all. And because and unless they focus, they really have to do a serious post-mortem of what went wrong inside their party and regroup. If they don't do all those things that I suggested, they face the possibility of disappearing on the political scene altogether. That is not a very healthy situation for kind of policy, for the political coaches in Zimbabwe. But that's a sensible responsibility that they have to face. As far as Morgan Tsvangirai is concerned, his days are numbered. I think the most grateful thing that he can do is to step down as leader of the MDC and then find a way of enabling his party to function with him in the background. He cannot lead the party any longer. I think he is a very presence on the political scene in as far as the MDC is concerned. It will cost them even more than it is done to now.
Okay, there are a lot of people who've actually advised Morgan Tsvangirai to step down since last year when he had his problems with women. It appears Morgan has not listened to any of these, and I remember a few months ago he attended an interview with the BBC where they actually hinted to him that the people no longer liked him. Why do you think Morgan Tsvangirai is still in denial?
I don't know how Morgan Tsvangirai is not capable of taking advice from anyone. And that's part of his problem, you know. Opinion polls were telling him that his support base was independent opinion polls were telling him that support was ebbing away from the MDC. He refused to take notice of that. People were advising him that, you know, his attachment to the West would cost him credibility on the African continent. He wouldn't listen to that. People were telling him that he needs to listen to his own grassroots, okay, about the candidacy and so on. He wouldn't listen to that. People were telling him that his private life would cost him votes daily and places and put it into context. He wouldn't listen to that. So what you have is a leader over time who appears not to take wise counsel from anybody on one hand. On another, he makes gaffes of the worst kind imaginable. So from that point alone, he has become he was the only brand that MDC had, but that brand has become a liability. So it's time to change that brand. Morgan doesn't listen.
Okay. And in the next couple of days, we are going to see Robert Mugabe choosing his new cabinet. A lot of people have said that there is a lot of talent within the MDC, and it would actually be a good idea if Robert Mugabe works with some of these talented MDC professionals. What advice would you give to Robert Mugabe?
I tell you the reason, you know, Robert Mugabe is more secure now than he's ever been. There is a lot more talent within Zambia than people give it credit for. This issue is not about talent. Zimbabwe is not in need of managers or skilled people. It is not because it doesn't have that lunar resource, one way or the other. What you need is a political, economic, intellectual knowledge base, ideological framework from which people deliver. Okay? And the part of the experience, looking back in Zambia's history, when it is relied on talent alone, it has backfired in the sense that people's beliefs came against what they were being asked to do. That's what Boram Sande was about in 2008. What happened? Zambia listened to the people after 2008. And what it discovered was that it was not because they weren't talent. What they discovered that the people in the house who did not believe in Zambia's spirit. So what you get this time, and Zambia has made it very clear throughout the campaign, never again will we find ourselves in a coalition, never again will we have a marriage of misalliance. We better stick with what we know what's best, and it's in the context of that Zambia will choose from within Zambia the party expects him to do so, the people expect him to do so. Now, there's a lot of people who have wanted another genuine coalition. You see, the parliamentary party, excuse me, Governor Mugabe's personal vote is increased compared to 2008. The number of people in the House of Assembly has increased compared to 2008. So there is no legitimacy from which you can come out of that to go somewhere else just to find an apartheid. There are so many people from which to choose from. And there are so many younger Turks inside ZANU-PF who are even more, who are waiting to deliver this business and making sure the land indigenization project works, to make sure that becomes the backbone on which economic independence and empowerment takes place. And ZANU-PF is not going to be looking to those people who are opposed to that project in the first instance to come and join them.
Okay. MDC is also being blamed for their failure because they were listening to Facebook Babajukwa, who said to have misled Morgan Tsvangirai. What do you think on this issue?
Well, Babajukwa did not come into existence until about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think the warnings about the demise of the MDC began way back. I mean, some of us began to make these questions in 2010. The most serious question is this. The MDC, it's not in Zimbabwe. It needs access to the internet and so on. You have to have a phone, you have electricity, you have all the kind of modes that you're available. Majority of people do not have that. So if you were focusing on the online activity, it is a very small urban constituency. Within that constituency, the MDC did not win the argument, right? They did not win, they lost the online argument as well. Nigeria comes in with a kind of, like a more panic on this question, simply to say ZANU-PF is corrupt. Nobody they did not address the bread and butter issues people were concerned about. So it was a red herring. Nobody took it seriously at any rate. So the idea that Babajukwa cost the MDC votes is fanciful. It is part of the way in which the MDC imagined itself. It imagined that somehow it had control on the online and somehow every voting person had access to it. It didn't. It just miscalculating. They didn't understand it. Okay?
Okay. Professor Shire, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that Morgan Tsvangirai also hired Alex Magaisa as his legal advisor. People are now blaming Alex Magaisa for Tsvangirai's failure, alleging that he failed to advise Morgan Tsvangirai and he actually slept on the job. What do you take of that one?
Well, I mean, I turn it on its head. I don't understand why Alex Magaisa went to join a sinking ship. That's been my argument with Alex from day one. I was surprised when I used to accuse him when he used to write columns for New Zimbabwe for being a sort of crypto MDC neoliberal. What I did not expect was he would actually graduate to become what I've described as Morgan Tsvangirai backhander. But Alex Magaisa is not alone. There is a whole culture, a thought collective of lawyers and all sorts who surrounded Morgan Tsvangirai, all of whom are culpable for the wrong advice that they gave to Morgan Tsvangirai. Political advice that they gave them. So to blame Alex Magaisa is to miss the point. But rather, it's not there is a conspiracy. It's that Morgan and the third collective around him think alike. They really did not understand that somehow, they failed to appreciate that the land distribution project was working. They failed to understand that it matters to withdrawn people. They were there when Morgan Tsvangirai was making threats to chiefs, saying to them, I will come and sort you out after the election. If that is not threatening people, if that's not intimidating people, I don't know what is. You know, they knew that the kind of like Ignatius, the support of the churches, the Pentecostals, where people actually go. Instead, they were just kind of like dismissing them as fodder. They use language in conversation with people, which is very rude, which is very obscene, which winds people up. They were there. So it's not Makaisa, it's a whole organization culture which was there. I am really surprised that Alex ended up in that place. I have no idea why he went there. He had a good actually academic career going. He could have continued to write. He can express his views like everybody else. But to join this outfit was completely beyond me. I really don't understand why he ended up there.
There are some politicians, ex-politicians and leaders who have called for Zimbabweans to protest and take to the streets and bring the country to a standstill. Do you think Zimbabwean people are capable of doing this time? Because I know from 2008 there was a lot that went on, and some Zimbabweans are actually saying they will not go to the streets to fight or to die for Morgan Tsvangirai while he's sitting in his house relaxing and enjoying his life. And people like Roy Bennett as well have encouraged Zimbabweans to take to the streets and protest. Do you see this happening this time?
Morgan Tsvangirai once said to ZANU-PF, to Robert Mugabe, leave before Christmas or we'll remove you by force. It didn't happen. If for a 1 million march was Zimbabweans to come like bring Zimbabwe to a standstill, it didn't happen. I mean, all these things have been said before, you know. Zimbabwean people are not stupid. They know what is at stake. And one of the wonderful things about this election is that unlike any of the last 6 elections we've seen, Zimbabweans themselves decided to conduct themselves in peace and exercise their right to vote. The last thing that they want to do is to go and create havoc on the streets. It ain't gonna happen, okay? Generating unnecessary pain for Zimbabweans at a time when we ought to be encouraging Zimbabweans to work together is seriously obscene. And I underline that without any reservation whatsoever. If Bennett has the interest of Zimbabwe at heart, what he has to do is to work within his party and acknowledge that they lost this election. And it's time for them to go to the drawing board and rethink where they go from there. Because the electoral map, the political map in Zimbabwe has shifted radically from what they thought it was in 2008. Remember, people who voted for them in 2008 were a protest vote. And ZANU-PF has demonstrated its ability to address those concerns. It has been on the electoral campaign since it went back to work with the people and corrected the aggressions people did have. And to suggest that somehow people are going to go on the street and be sure they'll be arrested for Roy Bennett is whistling in the wind. It's not going to happen.
Okay, one last thing, Professor Shire. There's a popular pastor in Zimbabwe who predicted 2 days before the elections that Mugabe was going to win the elections, and that God had told him that Mugabe was getting a chance to put things right and make Zimbabweans happy once again. But when people discuss this issue, they say that Mugabe's setback will be some of the ministers and people who work with him or for him, because some of them are not honest, they engage in corruption activities, and when they fail, it's all put on Mugabe. Now, because of Mugabe's age, they actually say he may not be able to supervise all his ministers and the people in the government as best as he should. What do you think would be the best advice that you would give?
There's a lot in that. First of all, there's another. See, one of the things about people who critique Islam politics, they start off from a myth. A myth is always what it is, a myth, okay? It is not a fact, okay? Anyone could have predicted this outcome if they simply looked at what are the central issues of concern to Zimbabweans and which political institution responds to those issues productively. That's the question. Whether you're a minister or a politician or a journalist or an analyst, one could have seen that by simply looking at the facts. The second thing is this. It's not in our culture, when we continue to refer to someone's age, we mean two things, okay? We either mean that they are now too old, they are senile, okay? Or we say they are a source of wisdom, right? That's within our culture. The cultural sphere is important in order to put that this meaning. Now, to Zimbabweans, the majority of Zimbabweans, when we say someone is old, akura, yes? It means they're wise. It is not an adjective of derision as most people are saying. Mugabe is able, is smart. He has always said, as long as my party wants me to lead, as long as I'm able, and as long as the people of Zimbabwe want me to, I will continue to lead. As far as I'm concerned, I put a tick in all of those three. So the argument about how old it is falls by the wayside. The second thing is, Zimbabwean politics, contrary to the election ceremonies in ZANU-PF, there's never been something that is led by one person presidential United States style. It's from the grassroots up. Okay? It is the people who make ZANU-PF. And the leadership of ZANU-PF will always be determined by the person who becomes the current or the next leader, will be the person who embodies the central values of ZANU-PF itself. And at the moment they are about the land, they are about the legacy of the armed struggle revolution, they are about the land question, they are about indigenization, they are about empowerment, they are about empowering ordinary people in the country. And the person who embodies those values now and tomorrow will be part and parcel of a collective leadership with what ZANU-PF is. So if you look at it that way, that is another misreading of the situation. I put it on its head. If the MDC wants to have any meaning whatsoever to the Zimbabwean people, it needs to rethink itself in that collective way, in which it speaks to the issues that affect Zimbabweans as a whole, and listen to them every time they are being criticized. Now, if ZANU-PF had not listened to what people said to it in 2008, it would have faced oblivion in 2013. And that's the lesson for the MDC. The trouble for the MDC since 2000, they have not listened to people. You know, they came with the slogan, change, in 2009. You can't maintain the same slogan for 15 years when conditions have shifted and changed radically 360 degrees. You are working on a completely new terrain. That's the difference. So the problem here is, the word corruption means all kinds of interesting things different times. What we have to do is to make our institutions, whatever they are, wherever they are, transparent and accountable to the people of Zimbabwe. Okay? And by making politics, there's more to politics. Politics is not restricted just to electoral cycles. Politics takes place in different forms every day between electoral cycles. And unless people see you as part and parcel there every day, they won't vote for you. Incidentally, what the ZANU-PF did after 2008, it went in the constituencies and worked from the grassroots out. And that's how you deal with corruption, by dealing with the people. Whereas with the NDC, when they came into office in 2008, they told the world that they would reduce international travel, they would reduce government spending, and so on. Guess what? For the last 4 years, every single month, there has been an MDC delegation in Brussels, in London, in Washington, doing God knows what, with an entourage the size of a football team. Now, people see that. They've also seen MDC people enriching themselves. They've seen the monies that were supposed to be deployed to constituencies disappearing. Their monies are supposed to be to support small businesses disappearing. And politics works in those kind of larger images. And unless people deal with those kinds of issues of accountability, they disappear. And that's the issue that's gone wrong. And that's the question that faces non-politics generally.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Shire, for your analysis. We hope to catch up with you again in the next couple of weeks when we discuss Zimbabwe. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye.